My name is Craig Stevenson, and welcome to the second part of our Tenable HyperQast collaboration on Active Directory. I've got Derek with me, and today we're going to do a deep dive into ransomware, how it attacks Active Directory, and how to stop it, or at least how to do whatever we can on our side to make it not as effective. So let's start off with Derek. Give me your description of what ransomware is, and then we'll dig a little bit into how it actually moves throughout an organization.
So, I'm going to use a generic form, right? Because it definitely vary. But the whole goal of ransomware is to infiltrate a network as much as possible. And it's morphed a little bit over the months, right? To where the ransomware wants to obtain the information, and then it wants to encrypt the information so that they have a copy, but the true owners have an encrypted version that they can't access without a decryption key, thus the ransom. And they are then told your data is encrypted. The only way to get the key is to pay us. And of course, one of the new features, I guess, of ransomware is to have the culprits then start to post information on the internet, kind of putting information out there that the victim wouldn't want someone else to have access to.
Gotcha. Random question. Do you know when the first incident of ransomware ever was? Curious.
I saw that honestly about a month ago, and it was quite a while ago. It was a little shocking that ransomware really isn't a completely new thing. But of course, it has definitely changed over the years. Back in the day, the attacks really wanted to disrupt things. Mm-hmm. And today, many of the attacks don't disrupt until the final piece. So a lot of things are happening in between the initial compromise and then the encryption of the data, such as creating backdoors for persistence, potentially gathering as much information as possible. Also, if it's supply chain, moving through. So you don't want to, of course, encrypt anything until you get full access to everything that particular vendor has access to. So it certainly has changed, but I really don't know the exact time that it started, but it's certainly been going on a long time.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the pieces of a ransomware attack have been around forever, almost.
Yeah.
Like the ability of someone to encrypt files on your hard drive, that's been around forever. Using an exploit to get into something, that's been around since computers have been around. But I think maybe let's walk through a typical ransomware attack in the different stages.
Yep.
And then while we're doing that, maybe we can drop in where Active Directory comes in. So
absolutely.
From my understanding, like step number one of a ransomware attack is a bad actor needs to get a foothold in an organization.
Yep, absolutely.
And that would normally occur through somebody opening a malicious email attachment. That's all your bog standard ways of getting access to an environment. Yep. Or one of maybe somebody in the organization took their laptop home and their kid hopped on and downloaded something awful onto the laptop. And then they took that laptop and walked it back into corporate headquarters and plugged it in.
Yep. So we call that the entry point, right? So back in the day, it used to be called the end point because really it was just as you said, right? Somehow, some way, someone, right, whether it be the 6-year-old that was playing on some cartoon website and, got a virus, or it was someone clicking on, oh, I want to see these kitty cat in this video, don't click this kitty cat video. But, phishing attacks, right? Yeah. And phishing attacks are still number one. I follow quite a few different sites that kind of do analysis on how they are attacked. And phishing is still number one. I think the latest I saw was about 60%. So where are the other 40%? Well, the other 40% is the rest of the network, right? Mm-hmm. So let's mention some obvious ones. SolarWinds, right? SolarWinds being an application / service. The number one attack known. Yep. Two would be Exchange server, right?
Yep. Well, let me stop on the SolarWinds for a moment, because that was a specific type of attack, which was malicious update server, and that's what happened with Kaseya as well, wasn't it?
I believe so.
Yeah. I mean, and that's I mean, personally, I don't see any good way. There's no super good way to stop that, because if I have an app, I can't see one. Maybe you can help enlighten me. I have an application on my computer. If I want that application to be able to be updated, then it has to trust the update it downloads from a server.
Yeah, but it was the whole infiltration of the update to begin with, right? I mean, that was that's where the hole was. And then also the overriding issues with applications and services having such high privileges is a major issue, which is, Orion with SolarWinds, Exchange server has privileges. It's why they become so successful, is if you find that vulnerability or you find that inroad in one and it has privileges, now all you have to do is exploit that everywhere and it's game over, right?
And you're good to
go. So exactly. And there's a new one, right? There's a new one that came out, I believe it was this week sometime, with ADFS, called Foggy Web. And, we're actually doing research right now on this to see how big of a deal it is. We've done our initial analysis, through things that are being posted, but we're also doing internal analysis and seeing where this is going to go. Because even though ADFS is not the preferred solution, it's still a lot of ADFS out there, a lot.
And what is it like? I think ADFS is Active Directory File System.
Federated services.
Federated services.
Okay. Yeah. So it's an authentication, right? So most people have gone to Azure Active Directory or some other identity and access management for that, but still federated services is out there. It was running, it was working, and people just kept it. And so that becomes another entry point, right? It may not have a direct, I'm in ADFS, so obviously I can get to AD, but it's one step away. And so many of these are one step away, just like Exchange, right? Exchange server, 99.999% of the time is associated with Active Directory. So it's one step away. The entry point doesn't always give that immediate next step to AD, but it depending on how they get in, it gives a really close proximity to it.
Yeah, I gotcha. So I'm a ransom, just to sum up what we've talked so far. So I'm a ransomware attacker. Step number one, I've gotten into an environment. I haven't encrypted anything yet. Step number two, I want to spread as far and wide as I can inside that environment. And if that environment is managed by Active Directory, that's normally one of the things I go after.
Absolutely. So let's before we get to that, there's one step that is vitally important that everyone needs to understand. So let's assume that user one clicks on something and they are infected with some malware. Okay. That malware must get local administrative privileges to do anything. Okay.
Yes.
And it needs local privileges for two reasons. Well, maybe more than two, but at least two. One is it needs local privileges to drop payload on that machine, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we all know that if you're not a local administrator, you can't install software. Almost in every case. I mean, there's a handful, but not very many, right? So the attacker needs local privileges. 2, the attacker needs local privileges to mine credentials.
Yep.
So the attacker wants to go into all the cached areas, right? Browsers, OS, applications, and get usernames, hopefully passwords. And if they don't have the passwords, they're going to try to crack the passwords with like password spraying or brute force attacks. Mm-hmm. So those are the 2 things that they need, but they don't have privileges in the network yet. They just have privileges over that machine. So a lot, there's a misconception that when someone says privilege escalation, it's only for the network. It's not. It could also be for that local machine. The other thing that they want to do is shut down all detection services on that endpoint. So antivirus, EDR, they want to shut it down. And that's been pretty prolific. A lot of posts recently on how these attacks shut down those endpoints. So if you're listening to this and your organization is relying on endpoint security, you need more layers because these attackers know how to shut those things down pretty easily.
Yeah. Have you heard of application whitelisting?
Sure, of course. That's actually built into Windows, right?
Yep. I only bring that up because a friend of mine has a application whitelisting company, and he was actually able to stop a lot of the recent ransomware stuff because, for example, let's pick an application that gets exploited all the time. Adobe.
I was just thinking Adobe. Yeah. That's a shame.
Adobe is one of the greatest post exploitation, or not even post, but like initial exploitation tools. Anyway, yeah. So one of the things that his software does is called ring fencing. So around the Adobe executable, it prevents the Adobe executable from doing things like trying to open Word documents or write to weird directories or go out to the internet to strange addresses. It basically says this is the allowed behavior around the Adobe executable, and it's not allowed to do anything else. So if it tries to do any of those weird post-exploitation steps, like writing stuff or installing stuff or doing any of that, it gets stopped all the way back at the source. But
but that sounds like a really cool technology. I mean, I used to work in the endpoint protection kind of space. And there was a really cool solution, and still around, that basically did token escalation. And so basically all applications run as a standard user until it needs to run elevated, but only that application runs elevated. It was a really cool technology. Unfortunately, both what you just described and this one, if someone's a local administrator, they can go shut the stuff down. I mean, they can go add stuff to the whitelist. They can do, they can say, oh, well, Adobe now can do more because now they're a local administrator. So that's the issue. That's why we need layering, right? What you just described as a technology sounds fantastic, but you can't rely on that. You have to add in those other layers for sure.
Yep. Yeah. Well, we can do a deep dive into some of that other stuff on a future podcast, because I just love technology, and I love when people are building cool stuff and not just selling fear, but selling new capabilities, which is always cool. But okay. So we talked about I'm back in the head of the malware executor.
Yep.
I've gotten onto a system.
Yep.
I've now gotten local administrator, so I can install bad stuff. Installing that bad stuff is going to serve 2 purposes. One, it's going to let me probably get credentials to an actual Active Directory. It's going to let me get domain admin. And if I've got domain admin, then I can take malicious software and push it out to all the computers in the domain. Is that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. But normally it's not that easy of a step, right? Okay. So what we're seeing is the initial compromise gets a dropper put on. That dropper, as you said, will enumerate AD, right? But when I enumerate AD as a user with local privileges, I only have read access into AD, okay?
Ooh, okay.
But I can get 90+% of what I need from AD with just read access, okay? So I'm going to drop in PowerShell. I'm going to drop in, other attack tools that allow me to enumerate Active Directory and the rest of the network too, right? So, but let's just focus on AD right now. So with this, right, local privileges, read access, I can get every single user that has any privileges through groups in AD, domain admins, enterprise admins, group policy creator owner, you name it, right? Exchange administrators, SharePoint administrators, any and all users, because it's read access, okay? I can get a list of all domain controllers. I can get a list of all user accounts and the majority of their attributes, okay? I can get trust relationships because it's all read access, all right? So now what the attacker has is the full view of AD and who has privileges. So now let's take one more step. Before we do anything else, I already said that one of the reasons they wanted local privileges is to mine credentials. So on this side, the user has a list of user accounts from AD. They have no idea what those user accounts can do. On the other side, because they just enumerated AD, they know every user that has privileges. Now it's match game.
Gotcha.
And if what they obtain through mining is on a privilege list, it's game over. That's it. That's all they need, right? And there's no other steps. It doesn't always work that way. And it's why, we have a tiered model. It's why we educate, do not log on to endpoints with privileged accounts. I mean, all these things are things that we've been teaching for years because of this. So that's where that dropper and the enumeration and the match game come in, is trying to find those privileged accounts.
Yep. And then all this stuff has to happen before they even begin to encrypt any files, right? Because you don't
totally.
Yeah, you don't want to tip your hand that you're in there doing things until such time as you've spread through as much of the network as possible.
Yep. And that's why, they want privileged accounts because, if I'm sitting in the security operations center, right, if I'm a SOC analyst and I'm looking at information that Bob, an administrator, does, how am I going to tell when Bob is doing things and when someone else is doing things maliciously? It's very difficult, right? Because it's impersonation. So, the attackers want to get in, they want to shut down detection, they want to enumerate, and then they want to move laterally. So what they do is they take their credentials that they got from device one, and they try to use those credentials against other devices. Again, as soon as they get to another device, they mine those credentials, and their list of credentials just continues to grow, and the match game continues. That's where lateral movement comes in, and they want to gain as many privileges along the way as possible.
Yep. So now I'm in my attacker hat. I've succeeded in mining local credentials, which enables me to move laterally. We'll skip some of the steps in the middle.
Yep.
Now I've moved laterally throughout the network, and the next step is I'm going to begin encrypting. Well, first, not begin encrypting files. The first thing I'm going to do is siphon as much useful information out as I can.
That's correct. That's correct. Now, I do want to mention one more step, because if I don't play match games successfully, I still have to gain credentials in AD. So how do I do that? Well, remember, I enumerated all of this information. There are some settings that are almost always required for AD for users and computers that can be exploited. Okay. One of them is referred to as Kerber roasting. So if I have a user account that has a service principal name, I can Kerber roast that account. And then I can get the password for that account. right? If it has privileges, that's what I go after. Other types of exploits are related to, let's say, Kerberos delegations, which users and computers have Kerberos delegations to access other parts of the network, other devices. And so both of these are very exploitable, and in almost every AD instance are configured. So the attacker is looking for those types of things as well, because that gives them a direct access to attack those accounts which have privileges, and now they have privileges. So there's two different ways. One is match game, and one is attacking accounts. And of course, you always have password spraying and brute force, which they try to do that as well. And that gets them to the point where now they have some level of domain privilege. So there's really three primary ways, and there's some others as well, but the primary attack vectors against AD are match game, attacking accounts, and then brute force against passwords.
Okay, let me make sure I got that. So it's and I'll just say that again, because that sounds very important. The top three ways are the match game, where I'm trying to match up the credentials I found locally with the stuff I'm able to enumerate from Active Directory.
Yep.
And then what was the second one again?
The second one would be attacking certain accounts that have certain configurations.
Gotcha.
Right? Those accounts have privileges, but you can't just know the password for those accounts. So you can Kerberos or impersonate those accounts with attacking.
Okay, gotcha. So I can't necessarily steal, I can't necessarily know the password for that account, but I can impersonate that account to do the things it's authorized to do.
Well, but you get the password to do that. But because they have Kerberos delegation, and because they have an SPN, the inherent nature of AD is kind of weak. And so you can exploit those to get the password, and then now you can be that account.
Gotcha. Okay, so the end result of Kerberosting is I have the password to that account.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Gotcha. All right. And then the third way was what?
The third way would be like a password spray attack, right? So you use a single password against every account, and you're just hoping that someone uses a common password, right? And that still goes on. It goes on a lot. Obviously, if I do a brute force attack, it's going to trigger something at some point, where that's why you use the low and slow password spray to where it doesn't trigger anything. And unless you're looking for that behavior, it's very difficult to see.
Yep. No, I get that temptation. Like, I mean, here at HyperCube, I have 50 different accounts and 50 different services in order to run the company. And it would be impossible for me to remember 50 different passwords to 50 different services. So we use a password management system so that every single password is not being guessed, first of all, and no password is used twice anywhere throughout the organization. But I get the temptation to do that, because when I started HyperCube and it was just myself, definitely didn't do that until the number of services got unmanageable, at which point we had to put a solution like that in. You're like, we can't.
Definitely.
Now we've got multiple employees using multiple services. We need to make sure that there's no, we don't want a bad guy to be able to find a needle in our haystack. Yep.
Because you get in and it's pretty quick. I actually had a conversation just last week with a pen tester, and he's been doing this most of his career, and he's like, 95% of the time, the very first thing we do, go after Active Directory.
Yeah.
And he said 90% of those times, there's something that allows them to elevate quickly through AD. So.
Yeah, and that's the nature of the game. That's why it's always so much easier to be an attacker, because the defender has to do every single thing right. Yep. And the attacker only has to find one thing they did wrong, and then it's game over. But all right, so ransomware, right? Well, we've got the full breadth of the ransomware attack, and let's talk about the Active Directory piece and how we can put things in place inside of Active Directory to stop the Active Directory part of that attack.
Yep. So now that I have privileges, I can do what I want, right? So with regard to the attack, I'm going to use group policy, right?
Mhm.
Because it's inherent turned on, right? It's almost
Yeah.
impossible to turn group policy off. So all of these devices are joined to Active Directory so that there can be central management, central authentication. And therefore, as soon as the device touches AD to authenticate, as well as periodically every, by default 90 minutes, it's going to check to see if there's any new group policy settings. Mm-hmm. So if I'm the attacker, I go into group policy, I configure the group policy to deploy my ransomware to all these devices, and it does it for me, right? And that's exactly what like Riot did, is it used Active Directory to deploy the ransomware, and now it's everywhere.
Gotcha. So we've now talked about how an attacker goes into Active Directory and exploits the different parts and the nature of Active Directory itself. So let's bring it around and talk about now, how do we secure Active Directory to make it much harder for an attacker to be able to exploit it?
So we got to go all the way back to passwords, right?
Yeah.
So first of all, don't allow your admins or help desk, anyone with privileges, to log on in any way to endpoints, and that will help eliminate that mining, right? Yeah. So if there's no credentials there, they're going to mine nothing. 2, there's something called LAPS or other technologies, Local Administrator Password Solution. LAPS is free from Microsoft, and it basically randomizes and controls the local administrator password on all workstations and servers, so that none of them are the same. That way you can't move laterally once you have those credentials. Okay, that's the first 2. Then within Active Directory, you have to make sure that only those accounts that should have privileges have privileges. Reduce privileges as much as possible. Okay. You also need to make sure that the easy settings to crack, such as SPNs and Kerberos delegations, are secured, right? So if a user needs an SPN, don't give it any privileges. If an account needs Kerberos delegation, make sure it's the highest Kerberos delegation possible. And of course, monitoring these things to make sure that the weird behavior around those settings isn't occurring out of band, out of what an administrator should be doing. So those are some core things that you need to be doing, as well as cleaning up old settings, primary group ID, SID history, right, which is related to migrations. I might have migrated from, an acquired domain back in 2008, and then I forgot that SID history was there and I no longer need it, but accounts have this ability to do other things. All of these legacy settings need to be cleaned up too.
Gotcha. And that's a good segue into, so how does the Tenable AD product help me do these things? Or I guess, what does the Tenable, let's start from the beginning. Which problems does the Tenable AD product help me solve?
So I just pushed a poll out 2 weeks ago asking, why is AD security in most organizations a mess? Mm-hmm. And I gave them the option of we don't have the knowledge, we don't have the time, all these things. The number one thing was we don't know where to start and how to finish. Okay. Mm-hmm. Whether AD is 10 forests and 100 domains or 1 forest and 1 domain, it's got a lot of nooks and crannies. Okay. So someone has to understand what information needs to be pulled out and how to analyze it. And it's not a list of 10 items. It's a list of 100 plus items. And it's not linear, right? I can't just say, oh, these are my 50 users that have SPNs and I need to fix that. A user with an SPN that doesn't have privileges isn't an issue at all. It's not an issue, right? So you can't just look at linear settings, and you have to know where to look at. That's what Tenable AD does first, right? So as soon as Tenable AD is pointing at Active Directory, it pulls in all that information and does the analysis for you.
Okay, so I put myself I'm in a company, And let's pretend for a minute that Hypercube had a massive on-prem Active Directory environment. And I decide, all right, I'm worried. I'm going to start taking security very seriously. We've had Active Directory for a long time. I just got the job as person who will get blamed if we get hacked through Active Directory.
Correct.
So step number one, I don't know where to start. So Tenable AD says, hey, there's a million different things that could be configured wrong inside your Active Directory. Let me analyze it for you and give you the list of what to do.
Yep. A prioritized list, right? So we go in and say, okay, these are the critical, these are the high, these are the medium. Start with critical because the critical ones are those that I've already mentioned, right? That the attacker can easily leverage. And it just gives you that list as well as, okay, well, and you may not be the expert, right? In AD. You're responsible for it, but you're not the guru because, well, you have to know Unix and Cisco and all the other devices on your network. So, you're an admin, right? So Tenable AD guides you through, okay, here's the issue. Here's how you would fix it. And here are all the things that you need to fix. Here's the list. So it gives you context instead of just saying, hey, I found something. I don't know if it's an issue or not. Good luck. We really need to help organizations understand what the issue is and how to fix it, not just there's a potential issue.
Gotcha. So the next part of my job, all right, now I've got Tenable AD in, and I've used it to help me triage the list of everything I need to do. Excellent. I've gone through my list and I've knocked everything out. But I have a sneaking suspicion, my Active Directory environment is not a giant static picture. It's changing as new people come on and different people need different permissions to do different tasks and all that type of thing. So my guess is the next thing the Tenable AD product helps me do, or at least I hope helps me do, is monitor as these changes happen, continuously monitor in my environment and say, hey, if you can scan it and tell me what's wrong one time, you ought to be able to be scanning it on regular intervals and give me the constant list of things I need to do in order to make sure my environment is secure as it can be.
Yep. So let's hit a couple of key points there. First of all, AD is not static in any environment. I don't care whether you have 50 employees or whether you have 50,000 employees, because humans, third-party applications, scheduled tasks, PowerShell commands are constantly changing things in AD, right?
Yeah.
So trying to look at all these changes and determine if it's a security issue is not easy. And so when organizations have an Active Directory change monitoring tool, that's for reporting. That is not for security, because if something changes in AD without looking at the relationships and attack paths, you never know if it's an issue or not. Okay. So you need something that can on the fly look at any modification to determine if a new attack path opened up because of that. Okay.
Gotcha.
And that has to be real time. To kind of give you some real world examples, we had a prospect last month that came to us and said, hey, we're a massive organization. We actually have about once a month, 1 million changes going through AD in a second because of their process. A human can't deal with that. No security team can deal with that. So that's where something like Tenable AD sees all these and on the fly can determine if a new attack path opens up for any of those 1 million changes as they occur. So, and you need to do this in real, not just at the 1 million changes per second, but just, on a weekend, anytime AD changes, you need to be able to analyze if a security issue opens up, because the attackers are waiting for those things to open up and they're going to pounce.
Yep. Do I have, as an administrator, something that would be interesting to me is the ability to propose a change to see what the implications are. Does Tenable AD let me do that, or does it do it only after I make the change?
Only after you make the change.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. But you got to consider that a change doesn't mean attack, right?
Right.
A change just means the potential for exploitation, right? Yep. Yeah.
Gotcha.
But so really, and so let's just quickly talk about architecture. So the way that Tenable AD does what it does is it taps into the replication stream of the domain controllers.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of looks like another domain controller. So as things are occurring in AD, Tenable AD is told about those in real time. We do not look at logs. We're actually looking at what is happening for the changes in AD. And we're able to do that with no agent. So we install nothing on a domain controller because we tap into that replication stream.
Gotcha. That's actually a pretty cool architecture. I hadn't thought of that before.
Yeah. And then we did mention, Orion and Exchange have privileges. Mm-hmm. Thus, that was so easily exploited and spread quickly. Tenable AD has 0 privileges, read-only access.
Yep. So even if someone somehow figured out how to exploit it, doesn't matter.
Yep.
They can't use it to propagate to
that's correct.
Laterally move.
That's correct.
Yep.
That's correct. Read-only access.
Gotcha. All right. Well, that sounds fantastic. Anything else you want to plug before we wrap things up?
No, I think, well, the last thing is, you have to be able to detect attacks too. Right. So many different phrases are coined around, assume breach and someone's already in your environment and whatnot. So you also need to be able to detect attacks. And there are some attacks against AD which are very difficult to detect. DC sync, DC shadow, golden ticket attacks. So, you can't rely on a SIEM and a SOC analyst to detect those because sometimes they bypass the logs. So this is the third prong, right? Where Tenable AD comes in. With no agents, with no privileges, we can actually detect those attacks as they occur.
Gotcha.
So pretty powerful.
Yeah, it sounds pretty spectacular. Hey, I'm just saying, if I were using Active Directory, I would need a solution that, if not is exactly, looks a lot like Tenable AD.
Exactly. It's true. I mean, fix AD. I mean, out of this podcast, the one thing that I want everyone to do is start to look at AD security right now. All right. Whether it's with Tenable AD or not, it doesn't matter to me. I want these attacks and breaches to reduce. The way to do that is you got to clean up what you have. That's where we start. And I write a lot of things on that on LinkedIn and blogs about how to start. So please, there are some free solutions. Actually, Nessus now has a brand new AD starter scan. So Nessus, you can download for free. You can do the starter scan for free, and it will start for you. So just start somewhere. Doesn't matter where you start, just start somewhere.
And then that actually brought up something interesting. So recently I've been poking in and around Azure, and all identity inside of Azure appears to be running through Azure Active Directory. So it does a lot. It sounds like, my gut tells me that a lot of the same security mistakes you could make on local Active Directory, you could make setting up your Azure Active Directory.
Different set of problems.
Believe it or not,
it's a different set of problems. If I'm going to take my pot shot at Microsoft, it's the failure to name Azure Active Directory something that makes sense, because Azure Active Directory has nothing to do with Active Directory. So it is a identity and access management solution. It is not a network operating system. I mean, just to give you examples, Azure Active Directory doesn't have group policy. Azure Active Directory doesn't have domain controllers, right? So it's a totally different thing, but there are still issues. And that's where Tenable AD, what we do is when there's a hybrid environment, on-prem and Azure Active Directory hooked together, we look at those connectors between the two, because that's where someone could leapfrog. That's where issues could occur.
Gotcha.
So we look at the Azure Active Directory Connect configurations to make sure that what is syncing is as secure as possible.
Gotcha. All right. Well, it sounds like we may have a third podcast idea with talking about Azure as opposed to just local on-prem.
And to kind of tee that off and to get people thinking, there's on-prem AD, mm-hmm. There's Azure Active Directory,
which isn't actually Active Directory.
It isn't, but Microsoft now has a Active Directory running in Azure service that has domain controllers.
Great.
Okay. So does AWS and Google.
Yep.
So that, I mean, we've actually here at Tenable written up descriptions about these different platforms and where Tenable AD fits into that, because it is getting very complicated on where AD is, how it's running, what are the moving parts. So it is quite complicated.
Gotcha. All right. Well, thanks for being on again, Derek, and look forward to exploring Azure in the not too distant future.
Sounds great, Craig.